"Well, what do you think of it?" Grant asked McNeil, when the other had finished running through the message. He was watching the engineer carefully for any further sign of strain. There was a long pause before McNeil spoke. Then he shrugged his shoulders, and his first words were an echo of Grant's own thoughts. "It'll certainly keep us busy. I won't be able to do all these tests in under a day. I can see what they're driving at most of the time, but some of the questions are just plain crazy." Grant had suspected that, but said nothing as the other continued. "Rate of hull leakage? That's sensible enough, but why should anyone want to know the efficiency of our radiation screening? I think they're trying to keep up our morale by pretending they have some bright ideas, or else they want to keep us too busy to worry." Grant was relieved, and yet annoyed by McNeil's calmness. Relieved because he had been afraid of another scene, and annoyed because McNeil was not fitting at all neatly into the mental category he had prepared for him. Was that first momentary lapse typical of the man, or might it have happened to anyone? Grant, to whom the world was very much a place of blacks and whites, felt angry at being unable to decide whether McNeil was cowardly or courageous. That he might be both was a possibility that never occurred to him. There is a timelessness about space flight that is unmatched by any other experience of man. Even on the moon there are shadows that creep sluggishly from crag to crag as the sun makes its slow march across the sky. Earthward there is always the great clock of the spinning globe, marking the hours with continents for hands. But on a long voyage in a gyro-stabilized ship, the same patterns of sunlight lie on moving or wall or floor as the chronometer ticks off its meaningless hours and days. Grant and McNeil had long since learned to regulate their lives accordingly. In deep space they moved and thought with a leisureliness that would vanish quickly enough when a voyage was nearing its end, and the time for braking maneuvers had arrived. Though they were now in a sentence of death, they continued along the well-worn grooves of habit. Every day Grant carefully wrote up the log, checked the ship's position, and carried out his various routine duties. McNeil was also behaving normally as far as could be told, though Grant suspected that some of the technical maintenance was being carried out with a very light hand. It was now 3 days since the meteor had struck. For the last 24 hours, Earth and Venus had been in conference, and Grant wondered when he would hear the result of their deliberations. He did not believe that the finest technical brains in the solar system could save them now. But it was hard to abandon hope when everything still seemed so normal and the air was still clean and fresh. On the 4th day, Venus spoke again. Shorn of its technicalities, the message was nothing more or less than a funeral oration. Grant and McNeil had been written off, but they were given elaborate instructions concerning the safety of the cargo. Back on Earth, the astronomers were computing all the possible rescue orbits that might make contact with the Star Queen in the next few years. There was even a chance that she might be reached from Earth 6 or 7 months later, when she was back at Aphelion, but the maneuver could be carried out only by a fast liner with no payload and would cost a fortune in fuel. McNeil vanished soon after this message came through. At first, Grant was a little relieved. If McNeil chose to look after himself, that was his own affair. Besides, there were various letters to write, though the last will and testament business would come later. It was McNeil's turn to prepare the evening meal, a duty he enjoyed, for he took good care of his stomach. When the usual sounds from the galley were not forthcoming, Grant went in search of his crew. He found McNeil lying in his bunk, very much at peace with the universe. Hanging in the air beside him was a large metal crate, which had been roughly forced open. Grant had no need to examine it closely to guess its contents. A glance at McNeil was enough. "It's a dirty shame," said the engineer without a trace of embarrassment, "to suck this stuff up through a tube. Can't you put on some G so that we can drink it properly?" Grant stared at him with angry contempt, but McNeil returned his gaze unabashed. "Oh, don't be a sourpuss. Have some yourself. What does it matter now?" He pushed across a bottle, and Grant fielded it deftly as it floated by. It was a fabulously valuable wine. He remembered the consignment now, and the contents of that small crate must be worth thousands. "I don't think there's any need," said Grant severely, "to behave like a pig, even in these circumstances." McNeil wasn't drunk yet. He had only reached the brightly lighted anteroom of intoxication and had not lost all contact with the drab outer world. "I am prepared," he said with great solemnity, "to listen to any good argument against my present course of action, a course which seems eminently sensible to me. But you'd better convince me quickly while I'm still amenable to reason." He pressed the plastic bulb again, and a purple jet shot into his mouth. "Apart from the fact that you're stealing company property, which will certainly be salvaged sooner or later, you can hardly stay drunk for several weeks." "That," said McNeil thoughtfully, "remains to be seen." "I don't think so," retorted Grant. Bracing himself against the wall, he gave the crate a vicious shove that sent it flying through the open doorway. As he dived after it and slammed the door, he heard McNeil shout, "Well, of all the dirty tricks!" It would take the engineer some time, particularly in his present condition, to unbuckle himself and follow. Grant steered the crate back to the hold and locked the door. As there was never any need to lock the hold when the ship was in space, McNeil wouldn't have a key for it himself, and Grant could hide the duplicate that was kept in the control cabin. McNeil was singing when, some time later, Grant went back past his room. He still had a couple of bottles for company and was shouting, "We don't care where the oxygen goes if it doesn't get into the wine." Grant, whose education had been severely technical, couldn't place the quotation. As he paused to listen, he suddenly found himself shaken by an emotion which, to do him justice, he did not for a moment recognize. It passed as swiftly as it had come, leaving him sick and trembling. For the first time he realized that his dislike of McNeil was slowly turning to hatred. It was a fundamental rule of spaceflight that, for sound psychological reasons, the minimum crew on a long journey shall consist of not less than 3 men. But rules are made to be broken, and the Star Queen's owners had obtained full authority from the Board of Space Control and the insurance companies when the freighter set off for Venus without her regular captain. At last moment he had been taken ill, and there was no replacement. Since the planets are disinclined to wait upon man and his affairs, if she did not sail on time, she would not sail at all. Millions of dollars were involved, so she sailed. Grant and McNeil were both highly capable men, and they had no objection at all to earning double their normal pay for very little extra work. Despite fundamental differences in temperament, they got on well enough in ordinary circumstances. It was nobody's fault that circumstances were now very far from ordinary. 3 days without food, it is said, is long enough to remove most of the subtle differences between a civilized man and a savage. Grant and McNeil were still in no physical discomfort, but their imaginations had been only too active, and they now had more in common with 2 hungry Pacific Islanders in a lost canoe than either would have cared to admit. For there was one aspect of the situation, and that the most important of all, which had never been mentioned. When the last figures on Grant's writing pad had been checked and rechecked, the calculation was still not quite complete. Instantly, each man had made the one further step. Each had arrived simultaneously at the same unspoken result. It was terribly simple, a macabre parody of those problems in first-year arithmetic that began, if 6 men take 2 days to assemble 5 helicopters, how long? The oxygen would last 2 men for about 20 days, and Venus was 30 days away. One did not have to be a calculating prodigy to see at once that 1 man, and 1 man only, might yet live to walk the metal streets of Port Hesperus. The acknowledged deadline was 20 days ahead, but the unmentioned one was only 10 days off. Until that time, there would be still enough air for 2 men, and thereafter for 1 man only for the rest of the voyage. To a sufficiently detached observer, the situation would have been very entertaining. It was obvious that the conspiracy of silence could not last much longer, but it is not easy, even at the best of times, for 2 people to decide amicably which one of them shall commit suicide. It is still more difficult when they are no longer on speaking terms.